Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza and look straight up, and you will notice something that should not be there, or rather, something that is not there at all. Where the four sloping faces of the world's most famous monument should meet in a single needle-sharp point, there is instead a flat, ragged platform, wide enough for a dozen people to stand on. The tallest structure human beings built for 38 centuries is, quite literally, unfinished at the top. And once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. For thousands of years, travelers have climbed to that strange, truncated summit and asked the same unsettling question. What happened to the tip of the Great Pyramid? The answer turns out to be more disturbing than any theory about ancient aliens or lost civilizations, because it is not a story about gods or catastrophe. It is a story about us. To understand what is missing, you first have to understand what was actually there. The pyramid you picture in your mind, the one from postcards and documentaries, is not the pyramid the ancient Egyptians built. That gray, stepped, weather-beaten mass of exposed blocks is the skeleton of the monument, not its skin. When the pyramid was completed around 2560 BC for the pharaoh Khufu, its entire outer surface was sheathed in gleaming white Tura limestone, a fine-grained stone quarried across the Nile and polished until it was almost mirror smooth. These casing stones were cut and fitted with such precision that the joints between them were nearly invisible, reportedly tight enough that a knife blade could barely slip between two blocks. The result was a structure with perfectly smooth, flat faces rising at a steep angle toward the sky. Not a staircase of rough steps, but a single continuous surface that would have caught the sun and thrown it back blindingly across the desert. Ancient writers described the pyramids as shining, and they meant it, literally. From miles away, in the flat glare of the Egyptian sun, the Great Pyramid would have looked less like a building and more like an enormous crystal planted in the sand, a beacon visible to anyone approaching the Nile Valley from any direction. At the very top of that gleaming shell sat a capstone, known by its Greek-derived name, the Pyramidion. This was the final piece placed during construction, a small pyramid in its own right that echoed the shape of the entire monument and closed off its summit in one clean point. We know that pyramidias existed on other Egyptian pyramids because a handful have survived. The most famous complete example, belonging to the pyramid of Amenemhat III from the Middle Kingdom, is carved from black basalt with the top portion inscribed, an evidence of gilding, kept today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Whether Khufu's own capstone was plain, the scale of the achievement this gleaming shell represented is easy to state in numbers and still hard to actually absorb. The Great Pyramid is built from an estimated 2.3 million individual stone blocks, most weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons, with some interior granite blocks, reaching 80 tons or more. It was assembled with no iron tools, no wheeled machinery capable of hauling that kind of weight, and no cranes. Yet the base of the structure was leveled with an accuracy of just a few centimeters across a footprint of more than 230 meters on each side, and its four sides are aligned to true north with a precision that would be respectable even by modern surveying standards. How the builders achieved that level of accuracy while also raising millions of tons of stone into a shape that tapers to a point over 140 meters in the air is still debated. Ramps, whether straight, spiraling around the exterior, or built directly into the structure itself, almost certainly played a role alongside levers, sledges, and an extraordinarily well-organized labor force numbering in the tens of thousands, working in coordinated shifts rather than as enslaved masses, as excavated worker villages near Giza have shown. That question, how they physically raised and positioned the stones with such precision, remains one of the few honestly unresolved puzzles about the pyramid. It has nothing to do with the missing capstone, but it is worth remembering, because it means the people who lost their pyramid's shining exterior to looters were the same people capable of building something modern engineers still argue about today. That is not what stands on the Giza Plateau today. Today, you see rough limestone core blocks stacked like uneven stairs, the color of sand rather than snow, and a summit that has been sheared flat. So where did the sparkling shell and the sharp point go? This is where the mythology tends to take over, and where most documentaries either shrug their shoulders or start whispering about extraterrestrials. The real explanation is far less mysterious and far more human. It comes down to one blunt fact. For most of its history, nobody protected the Great Pyramid because nobody who lived nearby thought of it as sacred, ancient, or precious. They thought of it as a quarry. Cairo rose on the opposite bank of the Nile in the medieval period. Khufu and his religion were more than 3,500 years gone, remembered mostly as vague legend. The people living in the shadow of the pyramid in the Middle Ages had no religious or cultural stake in preserving it. What they saw was a mountain of flawless, pre-cut, pre-polished building stone sitting unused in the desert at a time when the nearby city of Cairo was exploding in size and desperately needed material for mosques, fortresses, and palaces. Why haul new stone from a quarry? cut it, and shape it by hand, when a literal mountain of already finished blocks was sitting a few miles away for the taking, nature gave the looters their opening. On the 8th of August, 1303, a massive earthquake struck the eastern Mediterranean, centered near Crete, with an estimated magnitude of around 8. Its shockwaves reached Egypt and caused serious damage across the region, toppling minarets in Cairo and severely damaging the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, to the point that it never really recovered. That same earthquake shook the Great Pyramid hard enough to loosen a large portion of its smooth outer casing, stones, that had sat locked in place for thousands of years cracked, shifted, and in many cases tumbled down to the base, landing in loose piles at the foot of the monument. What had once required real effort to remove, prying an intact block free from a tightly fitted wall, was now lying on the ground waiting to be loaded onto a cart. The looting that followed is not a matter of speculation or folklore. It is documented history. In 1356, roughly 50 years after the earthquake, the Bahri Mamluk Sultan Nasir ad-Din al-Hassan ordered casing stones stripped from the pyramids to build mosques and fortifications in Cairo, including work associated with his own Sultan Hassan Mosque complex, one of the great architectural landmarks of medieval Cairo. Centuries later, in the early 19th century, the ruler Muhammad Ali Pasha had still more casing stone hauled away from Giza to build his alabaster mosque inside the Cairo citadel. This was not a single theft or a mysterious disappearance. It was an ongoing, government-sanctioned building supply chain that ran for hundreds of years, funneling pre-cut Tura limestone from the pyramid straight into the walls of the city across the river. Muhammad Ali Pasha's early 19th century removals were part of a much larger building boom as he modernized Cairo's citadel and constructed his grand alabaster mosque. And once again, the pyramids of Giza, sitting largely unguarded across the river, were treated as the most convenient source of finished stone available. When European travelers finally began arriving at Giza in large numbers in the 18th and 19th centuries, to study the monument seriously, they described the pyramid surrounded by great heaps of loose rubble at its base, the leftover debris of centuries of stripping. Now, their written accounts, journals, sketches, and early photographs all agree on the same basic picture: a monument progressively losing its outer layer, its base littered with fallen and discarded stone, its proportions changing slightly with each passing generation, as more of the original shell disappeared. Taken together, these records do not read like scattered rumors. They read like a slow-motion paper trail, each entry independently confirming the last, stretching from a medieval sultan's construction order through 19th century travel journals, all the way to the museum collections that hold surviving fragments today. And here is the piece of evidence that removes any real doubt. This is not a case of stones vanishing without explanation, leaving room for speculation about where they went. Tura limestone casing blocks originally cut for the Great Pyramid have been physically identified in the walls and foundations of buildings across Old Cairo, including mosques and fortress walls built during exactly the centuries the historical records describe. A casing stone weighing several hundred pounds, complete with the fine polish that marked it as original pyramid cladding, was later found among rubble at the base of the pyramid in 1869, and eventually made its way into the collection of the National Museums of Scotland, where it remains on display. This is not folklore passed down through generations. It is stone you can see and touch, sitting in a museum case, matched to quarry marks and construction techniques that tie it directly back to Giza. If a stolen object turns up inside the house of the person who stole it, there is no mystery left to solve. The theft is proven. That is essentially what modern archaeology has found spread across an entire city. So the smooth casing came off gradually, stone by stone, decade by decade, driven by earthquake damage and then by centuries of organized construction demand in a growing medieval capital. What about the very top, the missing point itself? The logic there is almost mechanical. The apex of any pyramid is its most exposed, most vulnerable section. It catches the harshest wind, it takes the worst of any seismic shock, and because the stones at the top are smaller and easier to move than the multi-ton blocks near the base, they were also the easiest to pry loose and carry away. Whatever pyramidion once crowned the structure, along with the uppermost courses of casing stone around it, was almost certainly among the first material to disappear, whether through earthquake collapse, deliberate removal, or simple erosion once its protective outer layer was gone. What survived at the summit was only the rough limestone core, the internal structural blocks the builders never intended anyone to see, now sitting exposed as a small, flat, wind-scoured plateau roughly 10 meters across. Surveyors have measured this loss with real precision. The Great Pyramid originally stood at approximately 146.6 meters, making it the tallest human-made structure on the planet for well over 3,500 years, a record unmatched until medieval European cathedral spires finally surpassed it. Today, without its casing and its capstone, it stands at roughly 138.5 meters, The missing top and the missing shell together cost the monument nearly 8 meters of height, which sounds modest against a building that large, until you remember that near the apex of any pyramid, the four faces are converging almost to a point, so even a small amount of missing material near the summit represents a disproportionate loss in overall height. Given how straightforward and well documented this explanation is, why does the missing capstone still generate so much speculation online? Partly because human beings are drawn to mystery, especially when it involves the oldest and most iconic building on Earth. The Great Pyramid has attracted more fringe theories than almost any other. Structure and history, everything from claims that its proportions encode secret mathematical prophecies, to suggestions that it was built or influenced by an advanced lost civilization, to outright claims of extraterrestrial involvement. Against that backdrop, a flat, truncated summit feels like it must be hiding something. Some versions of the theory suggest the capstone was made entirely of gold and was somehow spirited. Away intact, though this runs into an obvious practical problem. A solid gold pyramidion large enough to cap a base this size would have weighed an extraordinary amount, and removing it undetected, whether by ancient priests, medieval looters, or anyone else, while leaving no trace in any historical record, strains belief far more than the earthquake and construction supply explanation that we can already document. Other theories propose that something was deliberately hidden or destroyed at the summit, a device, an artifact, a secret marker tied to astronomical alignments. There is even a popular anecdote, retold in many versions online, about a 19th century inventor who supposedly climbed to the flat summit, wrapped a bottle in damp newspaper to improvise a crude capacitor, and received an electric shock, which some tellers use as evidence that the missing capstone had some hidden electrical function tied to the pyramid's shape. It is a fun story, but it is exactly that, an anecdote passed down with no reliable primary documentation, and even if some version of the event happened, static buildup on a tall structure in dry desert air is a mundane atmospheric phenomenon, not proof of ancient technology. Stories like this spread precisely because they sound scientific enough to feel credible while offering no actual evidence anyone can verify. These ideas make for compelling video titles, but none of them are supported by physical evidence. What we do have is a consistent, cross-referenced historical record. Earthquake damage in 1303, a documented royal construction order in 1356, further removals in the 19th century, and matching stones physically present in the buildings those records describe. When the physical evidence, the written history, and the engineering logic all point in the same direction, that is not usually where a real mystery is hiding. There is, however, a genuine unanswered question buried inside this story, and it is worth being honest about it rather than pretending everything about the pyramid's summit is fully solved. Nobody has ever recovered a fragment that can be positively identified as Khufu's original pyramidion. We know pyramidia existed on other pyramids from later periods. We know the general engineering logic says the Great Pyramid almost certainly had one too, since leaving the apex unfinished would have been strange for builders capable of the extraordinary precision found everywhere else in the structure. With a base level 2 within a few centimeters and faces aligned to true north with an accuracy modern engineers still study today. But whether that original capstone was plain limestone, polished granite, or partially sheathed in a reflective metal, and exactly when and how it left the summit remains genuinely unknown. That is a real gap in the historical record, not manufactured mystery for its own sake, and modern researchers have occasionally placed temporary survey markers or measuring poles on the flat summit specifically to help calculate what the monument's true original height and apex angle would have been. It is one of the few places where honest uncertainty and manufactured legend sit right next to each other, and it takes some care to tell them apart. If there is something genuinely unsettling in this story, it is not aliens or curses. It is the quieter, more human realization that the Great Pyramid's disfigurement was not caused by some violent, singular catastrophe. It was caused by ordinary indifference, repeated for hundreds of years, by generation after generation of people who simply did not see anything wrong with treating one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history as a convenient stone quarry. Nobody involved thought of themselves as vandals. Sultans commissioning mosque construction in medieval Cairo were not trying to destroy history. They were building their own cities, using the cheapest and most practical material available, which happened to be a mountain of pre-cut stone a short distance away. The idea that an ancient monument might have value simply for existing, as a link to a vanished civilization rather than as raw material, is a surprisingly recent invention in history. Nobody around it held that belief. And that quiet fact says something uncomfortable about how fragile even our most enduring achievements really are, and how much they depend not on their own strength, but on whether the people living around them choose to remember why they matter. The Great Pyramid is far from alone in this. Across the ancient world, monuments that looked indestructible were slowly consumed not by armies or disasters, but by their own descendants looking for a shortcut. The Colosseum in Rome lost much of its marble facing and metal clamps to medieval builders, who saw a ruined amphitheater as a convenient source of construction material rather than an irreplaceable landmark. Stones from crumbling temples across the Mediterranean world were repurposed into churches, city walls, and houses for centuries, with nobody keeping careful records of what was being lost in the process. The pattern repeats itself across cultures and continents. Ancient structures survive not because of their scale or the skill invested in building them, but because someone at some point decided they were worth protecting rather than mining. The Great Pyramid happened to survive with its core intact largely because its sheer size made complete demolition impractical. But its outer shell, the part that made it truly extraordinary to look at, was almost entirely lost this way, one cartload at a time. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the missing casing stones did not vanish from history so much as they changed address. The same blocks that once formed a smooth, sunlit surface on the world's tallest monument are today built into the walls of mosques and old buildings across historic Cairo, quietly holding up a different skyline, serving people who likely never think about where that stone came from. In a strange way, the pyramid was not destroyed so much as it was redistributed, spread outward into the fabric of a new city that its original builders could never have imagined. That is, not the kind of ending conspiracy theories are built from. It offers no secret chamber, no hidden device, no evidence of visitors from beyond the sky. What it offers instead is something closer to how history actually tends to work. Slow, practical, and driven by ordinary human needs, rather than grand design. It is also worth noting that the 1303 earthquake was far from the only seismic event to shake the pyramid over the centuries. A magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck Cairo in 1992, and it too dislodged more of the pyramid's remaining outer stones, even though by that point almost all of the original casing had long since been carried away. What is remarkable, and what modern geophysicists studying the monument have specifically pointed out, is that despite repeated earthquakes across more than 4,000 years, the massive core structure of the pyramid has never collapsed. Researchers using modern vibration sensors, placed at dozens of points inside and around the monument, have found that its enormous mass, its low center of gravity, and the way its interlocking core blocks distribute stress all seem to give it unusual stability under shaking, even though the ancient builders had no formal concept of earthquake engineering as we understand it today. That resilience explains why the pyramid's skeleton has survived essentially intact, while its skin was stripped away piece by piece. The core was simply too massive and too well built for medieval looters to dismantle, even with centuries of effort. It was only ever the thinner, more accessible outer casing and the small stones at the summit that proved vulnerable, both to nature's shaking and to human hands. The lesson embedded in all of this goes beyond one Egyptian monument. When something ancient and enormous shows visible damage that nobody living today witnessed directly, it is tempting to reach for the most dramatic possible explanation. Because the truth of slow decay and quiet, repeated human exploitation can feel almost too plain for a structure this legendary. But the discipline of actually studying the past, rather than simply telling stories about it, tends to reward the least dramatic explanation that fits the available evidence, not the most exciting one. In the case of the Great Pyramid's missing top, the evidence lines up cleanly. An earthquake in 1303 that is independently documented across multiple regions. A specific royal construction order in 1356, tied to identifiable buildings still standing in Cairo, further recorded removals under Muhammad Ali in the 19th century, and physical casing stones that modern researchers can trace directly back to the pyramid itself, some of them now sitting in museum collections thousands of miles from Giza. None of that requires lost technology, hidden rituals, or anything beyond what we already know human beings have done to ancient buildings throughout history, again and again, all over the world. The Great Pyramid still stands on its plateau today, watched over, studied, and protected in a way it never was for most of its existence. Its flat, unfinished summit is not evidence of some ancient secret. It is a scar left by thousands of years of neglect followed by centuries of deliberate stripping, and it stands as a quiet reminder that even the most extraordinary human achievements are permanently safe simply because of how impressive they are. They survive only for as long as someone, somewhere, decides they are worth keeping whole. The truly unsettling truth about the missing top of the Great Pyramid is not that something mysterious took it. It is that it took nothing more than ordinary human carelessness, repeated patiently over the centuries, to strip the shine off one of the greatest wonders the world has ever built. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most enduring monuments interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that separate real history from myth. Drop a comment below and let us know which ancient mystery you want us to investigate next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.